The Velen Dominion had ruled the stars for 6,000 years. They were old when most species were still learning to make fire. They had conquered 100 worlds and taken 1,000 species as their servants. To them, the galaxy was a garden, and every other creature in it existed only to serve their needs. When humanity first reached the stars, the Velen watched with mild interest. These small, soft creatures from a blue planet seemed harmless enough. They smiled too much. They talked about friendship and cooperation. They wanted to trade ideas and share knowledge. The Velen found this amusing, like watching a child offer flowers to a wolf. For 40 years, humans tried to make peace with the galaxy. They sent diplomats to every species they met. They learned new languages. They shared their music, their art, their dreams of a future where all beings could live together as equals. Ambassador J was the best of them. He had spent 20 years studying the Velen. He learned their customs, their history, their laws. He sat through meetings where Velen officials called humans lesser creatures and smiled through the insults. He believed that patience and kindness would eventually win them over. He believed that even the coldest heart could be warmed. He was wrong. The colony of Nu. Busan was built on a green world at the edge of human space. It was home to 2.3 million people. Families lived there. Children went to school there. Scientists studied the local plants and animals. Farmers grew rice in fields that stretched to the horizon. It was a peaceful place, full of hope and ordinary life. One morning, without any warning, Velen ships appeared in the sky. The colonists were confused at first. There had been no conflict, no disagreement. Some even thought it might be a diplomatic visit. They waved at the ships descending through the clouds. Then the harvesting began. The Velen did not see humans as people. They saw them as resources. The strong ones could be used for labor. The young ones could be trained as servants. The rest had other uses that the Velen did not bother to hide. Their transmissions back to their homeworld described the collection in cold, simple terms, like farmers talking about cattle. In 18 hours, every human on New Busan was gone. The empty streets held only silence. Toys lay abandoned in yards. Food grew cold on tables. The whole world became a grave without bodies. When the news reached Earth, people gathered in the streets. They watched the footage on massive screens. They saw the empty homes, the abandoned schools, the evidence of what had been done to their people. And then something strange happened. There was no screaming, no riots, no chaos. There was only silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The kind of silence that fills a room when someone has made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. Across the planet, humans looked at each other, and something passed between them. An understanding. A decision. The government called Admiral Kong Tai-ho out of retirement. He was 70 years old, with white hair and calm eyes. He had led fleets in smaller conflicts before, but he had spent the last decade growing vegetables in his garden and reading old books. When the officials came to his door, he already had his uniform ready. They sat him down in a room full of generals and politicians. They showed him everything. The footage, the transmissions, the evidence of exactly what the Velen had done and were still doing to the captured. The colonist Kong watched it all without expression. When it was finished, he asked only one question. Are there survivors? The room was quiet for a long moment. Then someone spoke. Intelligence confirms they were all processed. Within the first week, Kong nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had held his grandchildren, that had planted seeds in peaceful soil. Then he looked up. I will need full authority, he said. No oversight. No committees. No politicians telling me what I can and cannot do. The president of the United Earth Council leaned forward. Admiral, the Velen Dominion has 6,000 years of military experience. They have fleets that outnumber ours 10 to 1. Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. What exactly do you plan to do? Kong stood up slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Millions of people going about their lives. Children walking to school. Couples holding hands. All of them trusting that someone would keep them safe. The Velen have made a mistake, he said quietly. They think they know what war is. They have conquered weak species who surrendered after the first battle. They have never faced an enemy who would rather die than submit. They have never fought humans. And what makes us different? Someone asked. Kong turned to face them. His eyes were calm, but behind that calm was something ancient and cold. We remember, he said. We remember every wrong done to us. We pass the memory down through generations. We write it in books and sing it in songs. 1,000 years from now, our children will still remember what happened on New Busan, and we do not forgive. He walked toward the door, then paused. Tell the Velen nothing. Do not respond to their messages. Do not acknowledge their existence. Let them think we are broken and hiding. Let them believe they have one, and then. The president asked Kong open the door. Then I will teach them what humanity looks like when it stops being kind. The door closed behind him. The room stayed silent. Everyone there understood that something had changed. The humans who had smiled and offered friendship were gone. Something else had taken their place. On the streets below, life went on as normal. But in the quiet places, in the military bases and research labs and training facilities, preparations had already begun. The Velen had wanted to see what humans were made of. They were about to find out. 3 years passed in silence. The galaxy watched humanity with a mixture of pity and amusement. The Great Conclave, a council of the 12 oldest species in known space, discussed the humans in their monthly meetings. They spoke of the tragedy of New Busan as an unfortunate but predictable event. Young species always learned their place eventually. Some learned through diplomacy. Others learned through pain. The humans, it seemed, had learned through complete destruction. The Velen Dominion barely thought about Earth at all. To them, the harvest of New Busan was just another collection, no different from 100 others. Prime Keleth, the ancient leader of the Dominion, mentioned it once in a speech about the proper order of the galaxy. Weak species existed to serve strong ones. This was the natural law. The humans had simply been shown their place. But behind Earth's closed borders, something was happening. Yuna had been a university professor before the war. She taught history and languages, and she had a gift for understanding how other cultures thought. 3 days after New Busan, she was recruited into military intelligence. Her job was simple: learn everything about the Velen. For 3 years, she barely slept. She hacked into Velen networks using methods they had never seen before. She paid informants from a dozen species. She collected every piece of data she could find about Velen military movements, supply lines, and command structures. What she discovered changed everything. The Velen had never lost a war. In 6,000 years, they had never faced a real threat. Their military was designed for conquest, not defense. Their ships were built to intimidate, not to adapt. Their commanders had never needed to think creatively because their enemies always surrendered. More importantly, Yuna found their weakness. The Velen were proud. They believed so completely in their own superiority that they could not imagine a lesser species actually threatening them. They did not prepare for attacks on their homeworlds because they could not conceive of such a thing happening. Yuna brought her findings too. Admiral Kang. He read her reports carefully, then looked up with the ghost of a smile. They are sleeping, he said, and they do not know we are coming into their bedroom. While Yuna gathered intelligence, Commander Doyon built an army. Doyon was a soldier's soldier. He had grown up in a military family, trained since childhood, fought in a dozen small conflicts before New Busan, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw in the recruitment centers after the massacre. Everyone wanted to fight. Old men, young women, teenagers, scientists, artists, farmers, people who had never held a weapon in their lives came forward and asked to be trained. They did not come with anger in their eyes. They came with something colder: purpose. Doyon trained them differently than any army had been trained before. He did not just teach them how to fight. He taught them how to think. Every soldier learned Velen anatomy, their reaction times, their fear responses. They studied Velen tactics and how to counter them. They practiced fighting in every environment: jungles, deserts, cities, the vacuum of space. Most importantly, Do-Yun taught them patience. The Velen expected enemies to be loud and emotional. Humans would be silent and precise. The Velen expected enemies to attack head-on. Humans would strike from shadows and disappear. The Velen expected enemies to break when they lost soldiers. Humans would only fight harder. Every one of you is worth 10 of them, Do-Yun told his troops. Not because you are stronger, because you are smarter. Because you will adapt when they cannot. Because you fight for each other, and they fight only for themselves. Meanwhile, Chief Engineer Hannah worked on something that would change the nature of war itself. Hannah was small and quiet, the kind of person you might pass on the street without noticing. But her mind was extraordinary. Before New Busan, she had designed engines that let human ships travel faster than anyone thought possible. After New Busan, she turned that genius toward destruction. The Velen ships used something called null drives, technology they had stolen from a species they had conquered centuries ago. It was powerful, but unstable. Hannah spent 2 years studying captured Velen technology, running simulations, testing theories. On a cold morning in the 3rd year, she succeeded. She created a weapon that could cause a null drive to collapse in on itself. One shot would tear a Velen ship apart from the inside. No shields could block it. No armor could stop it. It was simple, elegant, and absolutely deadly. Hannah brought the weapon to Admiral Kong. She explained how it worked, how it could be mass-produced, how it would change the balance of power forever. Kong looked at the weapon for a long moment.
How many can we make?
He asked. Thousands, Hannah replied. By the end of the month, Kong nodded slowly. Then we are ready. That night, he sent a message to every human ship, every military base, every training facility. The message was only 3 words: begin final preparations. On the 3rd anniversary of the New Busan massacre, Admiral Kang stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Horizon. Around him, thousands of ships waited in the darkness between stars. Millions of soldiers stood ready on transport vessels. Weapons that had never been seen before were loaded and armed. Kang opened a communication channel to the entire galaxy. Every species with the technology to receive it heard his voice. 3 years ago, you took 2.3 million of our people. You thought we would cry and beg and learn our place. You were wrong. He paused, and in that pause was the weight of 3 years of silent preparation. We are coming, and we will not stop until you understand what you have done. The message ended. The fleet began to move across the galaxy. Species who had watched humanity with pity suddenly felt something new. Fear. They realized that the silence had not. It's been surrender. It had been a predator learning to hunt. Prime Kelef laughed when he received Admiral Kong's message. He actually laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. His advisors laughed with him, because that was what advisors did when their leader found something amusing. The insects think they can threaten us, Kelef said. Send a fleet, 300 ships. Remind them of their place in the natural order. General Oren, the most experienced military commander in the Dominion, hesitated before speaking. Perhaps we should send a larger force. The humans have been quiet for 3 years. We do not know what they have been doing. Kelef waved a massive hand dismissively. What could they possibly do? They are children. Their technology is primitive. Their species is barely 1,000 years old. 300 ships will be more than enough to crush whatever pathetic resistance they offer. Oren wanted to argue, but he had seen what happened to those who questioned the Prime. He bowed his head and gave the order. 300 Velen warships set course for human space. They were the pride of the Dominion, each one the size of a small city, bristling with weapons that had destroyed 100 civilizations. Their commanders felt no fear. They felt only anticipation. This would be easy. This would be fun. None of them returned. The battle lasted for hours. When it was over, 300 Velen ships were dust and debris floating in the empty void. The human fleet had lost 12 vessels. 12. Oren reviewed the battle data alone in his quarters. His hands shook as he watched the recordings. The humans had not fought like any species he had ever encountered. They did not charge forward in proud formations. They did not announce themselves with threats and demands. They came out of nowhere, struck with impossible precision, and vanished before the Velen could respond. Their weapons were something new. Small, fast ships would race toward Velen vessels, fire a single shot, and break away. That single shot was enough. Null drives collapsed. Ships tore themselves apart from within. Commanders died before they could give orders, but that was not the worst part. The worst part was how the humans adapted. When the Velen changed formation, the humans changed faster. When the Velen deployed countermeasures, the humans had already anticipated them. It was like fighting an enemy that could read minds, that knew what you would do before you did it. Oren went to Prime Keleth with his findings. He chose his words carefully. "The humans are not what we thought," he said. "They have prepared for this. They have studied us. They know our weaknesses better than we know them ourselves." Keleth stared at him with ancient, cold eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we seek peace. Immediately, before this goes further." The silence in the throne room was terrible. Keleth rose slowly from his seat, his massive form casting a shadow across the floor. "You suggest we surrender to insects? You suggest that Velen Dominion bow before creatures who were living in mud huts when we ruled the stars?" "I suggest we survive," Oren said quietly. "Pride means nothing if we are all dead." Keleth's response was swift. Oren was arrested, tried, and executed within a day. The official charge was cowardice. The real reason was that he had said what everyone was starting to think. On the human flagship Horizon, Admiral Kang received reports of the first victory. He did not celebrate. He did not smile. He simply nodded and gave the next set of orders. Ambassador Jay stood beside him on the bridge. Once, Jay had been the voice of peace. He had believed in diplomacy, in understanding, in the possibility that all species could live together in harmony. He had spent his life trying to build bridges. Now he watched Velen ships burn, and he felt nothing. "I tried," he said quietly, more to himself than to Kang. "For 20 years, I tried to make them see us as equals. I learned their language. I followed their customs. I smiled when they insulted me. I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, they would eventually accept us." Kong nodded slowly. "You did everything a good man could do. It was not enough." Jay's voice was hollow. "They never saw me as a person. They saw me as a clever animal performing tricks. All my kindness, all my patience, meant nothing to them." And now? Jay watched another Velen ship explode on the tactical display. "Now I understand something. They did not respect our kindness because they saw it as weakness. They only understand one thing: strength. So we will speak to them in the only language they recognize." Kang put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We tried to be friends. Remember that. This is not what we wanted." Jay agreed. "But it is what they demanded." Across the galaxy, news of the battle spread like fire. The conclave met in emergency session. The 12 elder species spoke over each other in confusion and fear. This was impossible. This should not be happening. A young species defeating the Velen? It defied everything they understood about the natural order. The Keth ambassador, oldest of the elder species, spoke into the chaos. "We have made a mistake," he said. "We watched the humans try to make peace for 40 years. We saw their kindness and thought it was their nature. But it was not their nature. It was their choice. They chose to be kind because they hoped kindness would be returned." He paused, looking around at the frightened faces of his colleagues. The Velen taught them that kindness is not returned in this galaxy. They taught humans that mercy is seen as weakness. And now, the humans have made a different choice. "What choice?" someone asked. The Keth ambassador closed his eyes. "They have chosen to become what we feared they might be all along. They have chosen to become exactly what the galaxy deserves." In the darkness between stars, human fleets moved toward Velen's space. They were silent. They were patient. They were coming, and they would not stop until the lesson was complete. The war lasted 11 months. In the long history of the Velen Dominion, no enemy had ever survived more than a few weeks. They had expected the humans to break after the first real counterattack. They expected surrender by the 3rd month. They expected the natural order to reassert itself. The natural order had other plans. Human fleets struck across 27 systems simultaneously. They did not fight the way the Velen expected. They did not try to capture territory or occupy worlds. Instead, they targeted everything that kept the Dominion running. Shipyards where new vessels were built. Fuel depots that supplied the fleets. Communication arrays that let commanders coordinate. Supply lines that fed armies. The Velen were used to slow, grinding wars of attrition. They had resources that could outlast any opponent, but humans did not play that game. They moved fast, hit hard, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. By the time Velen commanders figured out where an attack was happening, the humans were already gone, already striking somewhere else. Commander Dojan led ground assaults on 3 Velen manufacturing worlds. His forces moved at night, using tactics the Velen had never seen. They planted explosives on factory foundations and were kilometers away before the buildings collapsed. They ambushed supply convoys and left no survivors to report what had happened. They turned the Velen's own territory into a hunting ground, on the industrial world of Veth Prime. Doyan's soldiers faced a garrison of 10,000 Velen warriors. The Velen commander expected a direct assault. He prepared defensive positions and waited. Duhaon did not attack for 3 weeks. Instead, his forces cut every supply line to the garrison. They poisoned water sources. They destroyed food stores. They killed anyone who tried to leave. The garrison grew hungry, then desperate, then terrified. When Dojan finally attacked, it was not a battle. It was a harvest. After Veth Prime fell, Doyan found something in the garrison commander's quarters. A collection of items taken from conquered species. Jewelry, artwork, personal effects, and among them, a small toy, clearly made for a human child. Doyen held the toy for a long time. He did not know which child it had belonged to. He did not know if that child had been from New Busan or some other colony the Velen had harvested. It did not matter. He put the toy in his pocket and continued the war in space. Chief Engineer Hannah's null-drive weapons spread through the human fleet. Every ship carried them now. Velen admirals learned to recognize the small, fast human vessels that seemed to be on suicide runs. They were not suicidal at all. The pilots would fire their weapons, then eject seconds before impact. Human rescue ships were always waiting nearby. The Velen could not understand this. Their own soldiers were expendable. Their commanders saw casualties as acceptable losses. But humans risked entire operations to save single pilots. It seemed inefficient, wasteful, weak. It was none of those things. Every rescued pilot returned to fight again. They carried their stories back to their comrades. The message spread through the human forces. We will never leave you behind. We will come for you. Always. This did something to the soldiers. They fought without fear because they knew their people would move mountains to bring them home. They took risks that seemed insane because they trusted that those risks would not be in vain. The Velen soldiers had no such trust. They fought for glory and fear of punishment. When the tide turned against them, they had nothing to hold on to. They broke. By the 8th month, the Velen Dominion was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Their economy was collapsing. Their military was scattered and confused. Their population was starting to question whether their leaders knew what they were doing. Prime Keleth refused to surrender. He ordered more ships built, more soldiers conscripted, more resources diverted to the war. He gave speeches about Velen's superiority and the inevitable victory that would come. His people listened with growing doubt. Admiral Kong pushed forward relentlessly. He did not give the Velen time to recover. Every time they tried to reorganize, he struck again. Every time they thought they had found a safe position, humans appeared to prove them wrong. In the 10th month, human forces reached the Velen home system. The ancient heart of the Dominion, protected for 6,000 years, surrounded by the largest defensive fleet in the galaxy. The Velen expected a massive battle. They prepared for a siege. They thought humans would throw everything they had against those defenses and break themselves on the walls. Instead, Una found another way. She had spent months studying Velen communication networks. She knew their codes, their protocols, their security systems. On the night before the final assault, she sent a message to every Velen ship in the home fleet. The message appeared to come from Prime Keleth himself. It ordered half the fleet to jump to a distant system where a false human attack had been reported. Half the Velen defenders left. By the time they realized the deception, the human fleet had already engaged the remaining forces. The battle was over in 6 hours. Admiral Kang stood on the bridge of the horizon. As it entered orbit around the Velen homeworld, below him lay the capital of an empire that had ruled for 6,000 years. An empire that had conquered hundreds of species. An empire that had harvested new Busan. The Conclave sent urgent messages begging for restraint. They feared the humans would do to the Velen what the Velen had done to so many others. They feared extinction. Kang opened a channel to the planet below. "This is Admiral Kang Taiho of the United Earth Fleet. Your military is destroyed. Your dominion is finished. You have 1 hour to surrender unconditionally." He paused. "You took 2.3 million of our people. You could have taken nothing. You could have been our friends. Remember that in the days ahead. Remember that this was your choice, not ours." The transmission ended. The hour began to count down. Below, on the ancient Velen homeworld, Prime Keleth's government collapsed. Officers refused to follow orders. Advisors fled. Crowds gathered in the streets, not to fight, but to demand surrender before the humans did something worse. 53 minutes after Kong's message, the new Velen government agreed to unconditional surrender. The war was over. The lesson had been taught, but for Admiral Kong, for Do-Yan, for Yuna, and Hannah and Jay, there was no celebration. Only a quiet, exhausted relief that it was finally finished. And beneath that relief, cold satisfaction that the galaxy would never again mistake human kindness for weakness. The surrender ceremony took place on a Tuesday. Humans had a strange relationship with ordinary days. They fought their greatest battles on Mondays. They signed peace treaties on Thursdays. They chose to remember their dead on quiet Sunday mornings. And they accepted the surrender of a 6,000-year-old empire on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. The Velen representatives arrived on the human flagship, Horizon looking like broken creatures. Their proud bearing was gone. Their ancient arrogance had been stripped away. They moved carefully, fearfully, like animals who had suddenly discovered they were not at the top of the food chain. Admiral Kong met them in a simple conference room. No throne, no display of power. Just a table, some chairs, and the quiet hum of the ship around them. "You have terms to offer," the lead Velen representative said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Kong nodded. "You will dismantle your military fleet. You will release every species you have enslaved. You will pay reparations to every civilization you have harmed. You will submit to monitoring to ensure you never build weapons of war again." The Velen listened. They had expected much worse. "And Prime Keleth?" the representative asked. "Prime Keleth will face trial for crimes against sentient beings. He will spend the rest of his life watching everything he built be taken apart. And on every world your dominion has touched, we will build monuments listing the names of those you killed." Kong leaned forward slightly, including the 2.3 million from New Busan. Every name, every person, so that no one ever forgets what you did and what it cost you. The representatives signed the surrender documents without argument. There was nothing left to argue about. Prime Keleth was found 3 weeks later. He had fled to a hidden station at the edge of known space, surrounded by a small group of loyal guards. Yuna had tracked him there within days, but Admiral Kong wanted to wait. Let him think he was safe. Let him hope he might escape. Then Commander Do-Yan's forces breached the station. When Do-Yan entered Keleth's chambers, The ancient Velen was confused, angry, even now. He could not fully understand what had happened. He demanded to know what the humans wanted. Territory. Resources? Revenge? Do-Yan looked at him for a long moment. In his pocket, he could feel the weight of the small toy he had found on Veth Prime, a toy that had belonged to a child who would never grow up. "We want you to remember New Busan," Do-Yan said. "We want you to remember what happens when you hurt our people. We want every species in this galaxy to look at you and understand the price of cruelty." "You are just animals," Keleth spat. "You think this changes what you are?" Do-Yan shook his head slowly. "No. We are exactly what we have always been. You just never bothered to look closely enough to see it." Keleth was brought to trial. The Conclave watched. The galaxy watched. Species who had suffered under the Velen for centuries watched with something like hope. He was not executed. Humans did not believe in giving their enemies an easy end. Instead, he was sentenced to live, to watch every part of his dominion be dismantled, to see the monuments rise on world after world, carved with names he had never thought worth remembering, to spend his remaining years knowing that his legacy was not conquest, but warning. Ambassador J returned to diplomacy. But everything was different now. When he entered negotiating rooms, other species stood. When he spoke, they listened. Not because they respected his kindness, though he was still kind. Not because they admired his patience, though he was still patient. They respected him because they knew what his kindness had been holding back in the years that followed. Jay worked to build the peace he had always dreamed of. Trade agreements. Cultural exchanges. Scientific cooperation. All the things humans had tried to offer before New Busan, but now those offers were received differently. Now everyone understood that the hand extended in friendship was the same hand that had crushed the Velen Dominion in 11 months. Admiral Ang retired again. He returned to his garden and his books. He grew vegetables. He watched his grandchildren play. He tried not to think about the war. A journalist came to interview him once, years later. She asked how he felt about what he had done. Kong was quiet for a long time. He looked at the flowers in his garden, at the peaceful sky above. "I wish they had let us be friends," he said finally. "We would have been good friends. We tried so hard to be. We offered everything we had to give. But they saw our kindness as weakness. They could not imagine that we were being gentle because we chose to be, not because we had to be." He paused. "I wish the lesson had not been necessary." The Conclave drafted new laws. No elder species would prey on younger ones. No colony would be designated a resource zone. No harvest would ever happen again. Violations would be met with unified galactic response. Everyone understood the unspoken addition to that law. If the Conclave did not enforce it, the humans would. And humans, as the galaxy now knew, did not stop until the lesson was complete. 50 years after the war. Chief Engineer Hannah stood on the rebuilt world of New Busan. She was old now, her hair white, her hands weathered by time, but her eyes were still sharp, still clever. The colony had been turned into a memorial garden. Where streets had once run, paths now wound between trees. 2.3 million trees, one for each soul taken. Each tree had a name carved into a small stone at its base. Each tree was tended with care. A young Velen diplomat approached her nervously. His generation had grown up with the stories of the war. They were different from their ancestors, quieter, more humble. They had learned what pride could cost. "I came to pay respects," he said, "and to ask, do humans still hate us?" Hannah looked at the trees around her. The wind moved through their branches, a gentle sound like distant whispers. "We never hated you," she said. "Hate requires thinking of someone as an equal. Your ancestors did not see us that way, so we could not hate them. We simply corrected a misunderstanding, and now..." She turned to look at him. He was young, uncertain, carrying the weight of his species' history on his shoulders. "Now we can be friends," she said, and there was warmth in her voice. Genuine warmth. "That is all we ever wanted. We tried to tell your ancestors that, but they would not listen." Perhaps your generation will. The Velen bowed deeply. I will try, he said. I promise I will try. Hannah nodded. Then you have already done more than they ever did. He left quietly. Hannah stayed among the trees until sunset, watching the light filter through the leaves. Listening to the wind carry sounds that might have been voices, the galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity. Hoped it would never need to teach another, but if it did, they would be ready. They would always be ready, because that was what humans did. They remembered, they prepared. They extended hands in friendship for as long as friendship was possible. And when friendship was refused, when cruelty was chosen instead, they showed the galaxy what they truly were. Not conquerors, not monsters. Just a species that had learned long ago that kindness without strength was an invitation to be destroyed. And strength without kindness was what they fought. Against, they would be kind first, always, but they would never be weak again, never again.